Hello, it's Jack Tutor here of Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening, the podcast where I speak with musicians and sound artists about 3 albums that are important to them. My guest this time is Martin J Thompson. Martin makes electronic music that often seems to be talked about in terms of rudeness and etiquette, which is funny because Martin's a lovely bloke. But his music, I don't know why, but in texts that I've written and also in reviews I've read, this idea of etiquette seems to come up a lot. I mean, repetition is at the forefront. The textures he uses often have a jagged edge, fill up space. Maybe there's a sense that they're pestering or setting very explicit demands on your concentration on time and space. There are these sliding rhythms that seem to be falling outside of your grasp as a listener and never really seem to come back within your grasp over the 6, 7, 8 minutes that you are confronted with these sounds. Martin is also involved in the label found at sm-ll.com and also partner label Tapes for Mates. Neither of these labels use artist attribution, so there's no artist name on any of the releases. Something that has provoked a lot of discussion between Martin and everyone really, and also myself. Raises a lot of questions around the economy around music. I know Martin is an anarchist, also incorporates principles of agile working into both of those labels. So I really enjoy talking to Martin about all this stuff and also about listening to music generally. Essentially, I like coming up with different excuses to have a conversation with him. And this is another one. I hope you enjoy this one. I really like the 3 records that Martin picked, and there's loads of good anecdotes in there too. Head over to sm-ll.com, probably the best place to get an idea of what Martin is doing. We also talk about his mastering, causeandcondition.com, and head over to attentionmagazine.co.uk/crucial listening for all the usual links there. Attention Magazine is on Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/crucial listening. If you want to chip in a couple of quid to help keep the show ticking. But thank you, as always, for listening and supporting the show. I love getting your lovely feedback. Okay, here we go. This is Martin J Thompson on Crucial Listening. Hello Martin, welcome to Crucial Listening.
Hello Jack, nice to be here.
Great to have you. So you're here to talk about 3 important records, as our guests do. Before we get into those, I want to ask you about a few bits. I mean, we talk pretty much all the time, so
We do.
I know there's a lot of things that you've got going on at the moment that we could touch on at this point in this early part of the conversation. One thing though that does come up a lot between us, and also that you flagged when I asked you, is mastering. It feels like that you've undergone a bit of a shift in how you're thinking about mastering. I mean, most evident in the fact that we've got causeandcondition.com, which has just arisen recently, which feels to me like more of just well, I know it is more than just a switch from the alias that you're using for mastering, and more of a holistic difference in approaching mastering, how you think about it. I mean, what's led you to that point of shifting from mastering under your own name or something else to bringing Cause and Condition into the frame?
I think, I mean, it's a super interesting and kind of challenging question in a lot of different areas, I guess. But the main shift has been having to kind of deal with some kind of government stuff with my partner's visa, and having to deal with money and work, the idea of like 9 to 5 job and all those kind of things that everybody has to deal with, and having got lots of kind of quite problematic targets out the way that are kind of, stipulated by the government, which I won't get into, right, yeah. Is kind of given me this complete like lift. I've like not had those challenges to meet anymore. I've kind of succeeded, if you like, and having succeeded in those things, these are things I didn't really want to do or don't agree with, but kind of had to do, and succeeded quite well in them. In terms of like, if I'm going to have to do this, if I'm going to have to earn money in this area, I'm going to really do well. If I'm going to have to work in this industry, I'm going to really push it hard, because this thing, getting this visa with my partner is obviously incredibly important to me. Off the end of that, thinking, well, why is it that I can do this thing that I fundamentally disagree with and really succeed well at it, but I'm still hesitant to kind of put myself out there in other ways. And I think the challenge always comes down to the money aspect and how you understand that kind of pathway that generally isn't written under the capitalist model. So like, I don't really like the idea of, that it be a profit motive for everything. I think I really value, like within the sort of music that I listen to and the scenes that I got into in the 90s, that this was kind of like a very different space that was kind of the opposite of the pop industry, opposite of corporate industry, opposite of all that stuff. It was community, it was people, it was finding something in music that really felt it spoke a different vocabulary. It was more universal. Mm-hmm. And like the challenge of how do you deliver that, or how do you create something that captures that, but is still having to deal with the inevitability of having to pay the rent.
Yes.
And I think through having worked with lots and lots of different artists through the label, and having hung around with different people that have made music or introduced writing music to many friends over the majority of my life, I've really enjoyed that, the connectivity part, the understanding, the sharing of interests, the kind of elevating everyone together, the kind of we all benefit if we all just kind of share and it's open. I've really, really, really appreciated that. So Cause and Condition was really the success, if you like, of finding a way, which is a pay what you can model, that people that are in a kind of niche electronic music space that may or may not be fully understanding of the way the industry is, having to go after a really high-end professional mastering studio. They might be just someone who's just kind of, playing around with music for a few months. That there's something really advantageous about going through that cycle of having other people work with your music, about collaborating and having that wisdom shared, and also knowing that the people that might not have that much experience have also got really valuable wisdom. There's a lot of mutual interest there. So really having the success of something I didn't want to do and then putting it into a thing, giving me the motivation to put it into something else was really the shift moment, I guess, which having said that out loud, I appreciate that's really complicated, but it's easy as just suddenly realizing, actually, this is, all of a sudden this seems doable. It was a light bulb moment, if you like. It was, and that was kind of the shift, I think.
Has that enabled a different approach to the actual raw skill of mastering? And the reason I ask is, I guess a lot of what you're talking about is the framework around the skill, but often having to work in ways around money that feel discordant with your values or kind of run contrary to getting the most out of the skill itself often dents the actual just like fun and enjoyment or the ability to like really get into mastering, right? So has it been a different experience actually physically doing the mastering on your end, having moved to Cause and Condition and sort of rethought the framework around how you do mastering?
Yeah, definitely. It's the whole, I guess the equivalent would be doing something because you genuinely want to do it and understanding what that is versus kind of just going along with the motions because there's a skill you have and it might pay the rent. I think there's a genuine satisfaction and clarity that suddenly emerged around the particular qualities within certain practices that I really appreciated. So within mastering specifically, like I've done mastering for years for my own kind of projects and for I used to I co-founded a label back in, I don't know, a while ago with a friend, Adam, and used to do the mastering for some of that as well. And it was always it was never really seen as mastering as the kind of job, if you like. It never felt like it was for earning money. It was always a sort of self-initiated projects, or the projects that you're kind of connected to from mutual friends, for example. But this actually being positioned as a service, there was a moment where I thought, how, what I had done before the light bulb moment, if you like, how is this going to work? Because I don't want to be sitting around every day mastering music that I can't stand listening to and bringing the very world that grinds me, which is feeling, the inevitability of having to do something to pay the rent, be in my music world as well, because this world is valuable because of its universal, this kind of universal feeling that I spoke about. So I think a lot of it comes from my experience with working with agile principles, and that you've got many of these, this open way of thinking, and that you're not governed by sort of industry ideas, that you're governed by more a set of tools that allow you to get to a point, and you're not necessarily sure what that point is. So cause and condition really kind of is attempting to look at that in the same way that what do we really need right now for a particular sort of group of us, and what is it about mastering, currently within this small niche that could be different? What is it about all these kind of, all these services that are online through apps, or, master yourself with a click of a button? What is it about these things that can be advantage and not advantage? And just trying to find a space that really enables more interaction and more bespoke services. So I think that for me, and not having a money attached to it specifically, it being really open, and the reality of I have to pay rent and I have to eat like anybody else. It's not, there's a feeling of security there where people think, well, I don't necessarily know, or I'm not sure, and that you can come to an agreement through discourse and find what works best for people. Specifically, if someone hasn't got very much money, it doesn't matter. If someone has got loads of money, it doesn't matter. It's really about the conversation and what you're trying to achieve and what you think is valuable, which is just completely open. So I find that really satisfying on a fundamental level, and to be able to kind of apply it to mastering as well. And that has directly changed how I feel about mastering. So I'm really excited just to sit down with the equipment and work on something. It's been, and I think the biggest challenge is I was still falling into the habit of saying, I need to do some work today. And I made this rule for myself, like it's not work anymore, because that idea of work is not something I'm interested in anymore. So yeah, it's a complicated thing, still going through the learning process in terms of my headspace with it. But super, super excited about it.
Great. One other thing I wanted to touch on as well was something that came into my head while I was prepping for this podcast, which is related to the music that you make. So I think we were on Lucia, your partner's radio show, back in like September, and you mentioned at one point that the music that you've been making seemed to be getting harder and harder at that particular point. I'm intrigued to know whether that's still the case, that you feel like your music's heading in that direction, the music you make, and if you've got any thoughts as to why that inclination started to come in to make like harder and harder music.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes through phases. I think there's something about the energy in harder music that I hadn't explored for a really, really long time, and still haven't really, I haven't really scratched that itch, so to speak, still now. I definitely think it's still going to be pushing in that harder direction. I wouldn't say it's going to keep getting harder and harder and harder. It's not going to get more aggressive and more distorted. It's more a case of trying to find. There's a sense of energy that I think that sort of quality of harder music finds that more delicate textures don't. I think the energy of harder music seems to find that sort of delicate music doesn't. So I think there's something in that I feel is more impactful, that it kind of takes a little bit more investment from the listener. The listener really has to be in a headspace that can kind of deal with that sort of energy. I think the other thing as well is I kind of listen to a lot of stuff on headphones, and I find really hard music through speakers, you really have to have it sort at quite a volume in quite a decent set system, where if it's on headphones, it's really about that kind of drilling into the inside of your head, if you like.
Yes.
It's really a part of what you are.
Yes.
And I think there's a thing of the kind of qualities you can get at that are really detailed, but when that sort of heaviness gets put towards the sounds, it kind of sort of heightens that. So I guess it's almost like a caffeine addiction, I guess, in some way. You need a little bit more, you find a little bit more, and you just want to draw that out. I think the other thing as well, there's not anything I'm really hearing that is what I would consider sort of listenable or listening music that's that sort of hardness so much. It's often kind of borrowing from the kind of club scene or dance scene, or maybe from other kind of like obvious sort of genres. So the idea of the stuff that we've been exploring, that's a really relentless, monotonous, repetitive, sort of almost psychoacoustic, but through a distorted or heaviness, is something I've not really heard. So I think that's kind of probably been the main sort of driver behind it. As with most of the stuff I make, it's really, I want to hear something that I've not heard.
Nice. Well, I'll put some links in the show notes to some examples of that and lots of other stuff that you do too. We've only touched on a little bit there. But let's go on to your important records, Martin. So you've picked 3 of those. First question for you is whether or not you thought about important and importance in a particular way in order to come up with the list of 3 records that you did.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even Desert Island. This is more difficult, you know. This is it's sort of like the idea of what's important to me. It felt like it had to be, and we've kind of touched on this already, that idea of a shift in my interest or my direction in music making. And I think like I've been making music since I was 10 years old and been interested around it, you know, before, but not really at a kind of critical level, I guess, till a bit later. But recognizing that music that seemed to suddenly take me in a different direction was kind of one definite consideration. And the other consideration was I was kind of hesitant to put certain music in there because it seemed so obvious, but at the same time just kind of tried to ignore it because everyone's reaction and interest in music is entirely different. So I'm kind of hopeful that even though the music I've picked is pretty well known, maybe my angle to it isn't is interesting at the very least. But if it's not interesting to talk about, I mean, it's not really listening to me, so it doesn't really matter. I mean, that was kind of how I got to it.
Amazing. Well, let's hope this conversation is interesting. I really hope so. We can always not publish it. Right, so let's go for your first record, Martin. Which one do you going to go for first?
Well, the first album would be Frequencies by LFO.
Yeah. So start by telling me a little bit about why this one's important to you then.
I think I think still this album from a quality point of view in terms of the sounds, the kind of quality of those sounds, there is nothing out there I've heard that even comes close to sounding like this. Yeah. And I would go so far as that the LFO music that came after it, that was mainly, you know, like with the exception of the few of the singles and stuff that come around the same time as the album, but the albums that come after it, that was Mark Bell on his own,
yes,
also did not come close to this album. So they were in a moment, I think, through Varley and Bell's collaboration in the early 90s and around the house and sort of dance scene, and also the kind of rave scene at its kind of commercial peak, if you like. Yes. Tapped into something that was a highly experimental, refreshing take on kind of quite well-known tropes of that sort of genre. And even when I heard it, I think the first time I heard it, my older brother had bought it. LFO, I think, got to I want to say number 1, but it might have been number 2 or something. It got kind of high in the charts. It was quite a well-known track that came out amongst many other really hideous rave tunes at the time. And this one just sounded like LFO, which was the single that come from this album, was like, what the hell is this? This is out of this world. But I don't think the understanding of why this was so good at the time was really there. You got a sense that this sounded different, but we kind of have to remember at the time, there was so much diversity that was under kind of one umbrella of say, a dance genre or house genre. It was really difficult. We were still exploring what these sounds were. So the fact it sounded so different wasn't too out of place. And yet when I think back, it still felt quite different. And it was a few years later through buying an album, I think it was Polygon Window on Warp Records, I recognized the Warp logo and was thinking, hang on a minute, I've seen that LFO album is on the same label. And I think that would have been probably the kind of confirmation, if you like, of this, or like the picture was the jigsaw puzzle, or the picture was starting to make a bit more sense. And revisiting time and time again, this album has got nothing but better and better and better. And I listened to a few clips just before we jumped on the call, Jack, and it's just incredible. It's absolutely incredible. The sounds, the metallic nature of those hats, the stabs that are kind of Kraftwerk-esque stabs, this distortion through the sampling manipulation, and the whole melodic structure, this kind of high riff and then duplicated into a low riff but slower because of pitch sampling of the sampler is just amazing. Yeah, I've tried to rip this album off many times and just given up. It's amazing. It's amazing.
So your brother got it first and you heard it. How old were you?
Well, it would have been 91. So what would that be like? Maybe pre-teens, early teens.
Wow.
Trying to do my math. Probably like early teens. It would have been early teens. So I think LFO, the single, may have come out before the album. I'm pretty sure the LFO single come out before the album. Yeah. So.
Yeah. I read that that single did really, really well, like better than I think they ever could have expected. And they were like, right, we want to get an album done and dusted by the end of the year, like on the strength of why that was so popular. So you were then, if it was pre-teens, you were making music around like when you went from when you were 10, you say. So you were making music, I guess, at the time that you heard this for the first time. Like, what can you remember? Like, what your music making was like up until you heard LFO?
The dates definitely get patchy, but I remember. I mean, the early music making would have been inspired by. I mean, we would have been using sort of just a household keyboard from the back of like Kay's catalog, which I don't know if that even exists anymore, but like a bigger version of Argos. You know, you'd have a child's keyboard section. I'd have been using keyboards like that, and I think one of them had MIDI, and I used Music X on the Amiga. So that had Octa MED, which had like some tracker software, and I was kind of playing around that. So a lot of the stuff that I would have been doing before the kind of like rave scene, if you want to call it that, was sort of inspired by me just playing around on equipment. And then Jean-Michel Jarre kind of come in a little bit. I think there was a Pet Shop Boys rip-off because my brother was into Pet Shop Boys, and I kind of wrote that with him in mind. And then the kind of Warp stuff and LFO come out. I think sort of mid-teens, I managed to have a bit more equipment, and there was definitely some tracks that had sort of hollow bass sounds and sort of spooky chord sequences and metallic hats, which if you listen to anything I write now that's melodic, is basically the same stuff from back when I was a preteen. So definitely had a big inspiration, a big influence on that sort of sound, for sure.
I read an article that kind of places this record, I don't know how accurate it is, but in the context of those early days of Warp, because I mean, you may know, I don't know how old Warp was at that point, but the suggestion is that the label was still finding its feet back then. I mean, where did this take you in terms of like your relationship with Warp? I mean, how deep did you dive at that point? You mentioned that obviously you recognised the logo on another record. I can't remember which record you said it was, but what did this do in terms of introducing you to Warp as a whole?
I think that changed over the years that I've revisited. So I'd say the initial experience with Warp Records would have been through this album, but Warp Records that you might think of as a label was not really known when this album came out, for me anyway. So there was definitely stuff that come out before this album, not many things though. It was, like you say, finding its feet, but Warp wasn't a label I knew of. it was just the cover of that release is very enticing. There's not a lot on it. And the logo's just kind of small in the corner, but it was a logo that seemed to mean more than, say, Capitol Records or Polymor or whatever. It had something that meant something, and you knew it meant something because of the emerging kind of sort of rave scene, if you like. I think it wasn't until the Polygon Window album that I bought, would have been a few years later, I think. I want to say 93, I might be wrong with that. And then realizing the connection of Warp, and then thinking, wait a minute, Warp is a label that's put out more than just this album I've bought. And I went back to the LFO album. I didn't actually own this album at that time, this point out. I bought the album a lot later, so it was my brother's album. I'd go and nick it from his bedroom for a long period of time. And then starting to Polygon Window, and then all the stuff, the artificial intelligence series kind of come out a few years after that. So it all kind of started to make a bit more sense. And the reputation of Warp, getting their newsletters, We Are Reasonable People, and them recalling the LFO release and them still being true to themselves, which they've probably not done for a while, to be honest. I definitely aren't a Warp person, or have been for a very, very long time. But that early period is an exciting one because people are, for the exploration. You could hear that sort of in those early releases, yeah.
Yeah. And with this LFO release as well, I'm intrigued because, it has been in your life for about 1991. So where are we? Oh my God, come on, maths. 30 years now. So, I mean, as you say, it's still a presence within your music currently. But how has your relationship with the record as a listener changed over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like sometimes you listen to old music after a gap, and it sort of really sounds like of that era, and the sounds almost sound different in some albums that you think, oh wow, I didn't realize it was that kind of cheesy, or that it can sometimes be disappointing, or you hear particular synthesizers, and if you worked or you own that synthesizer, you suddenly recognize it differently. I think the only thing with the LFO album that comes to mind is it still sounded like I don't know like how it's made, I mean, I kind of do know because there's been a lot of documentation about it, but from a listener's perspective purely, and not from a research point, there's nothing in it that's obvious that tells you how it's made. And when I understand what equipment was used, it's just, I can only attribute it to Mark Bell's recognised as being incredible with his sound design. He's done stuff with Bjork and various artists that's amazing. But and Vali always gets sort of overlooked, but if you listen to Mark Bell on his own, you can hear one half of this LFO album. It's a very sonic quality kind of sound designery thing, but that sort of almost like rudimentary dance music formula that Vali brought to it at that point is what hits this. It's the context of dance music, but in this really abstract, metallic, kind of crunchy format that I think also not to forget that the dance music often followed not only a structural format but a sonic format. Like everyone was trying to make the same kind of records in a way and failing. And even Mark Fell kind of says about trying to make house music and failing, although he's a lot later in that sense. But this was not trying to make the same music and failing. This was what they defined, especially in the opening voice that talks about what is house. It's challenging the context of a genre that I had yet to even really discover at that point. And I think that opening and that whole kind of idea of presenting the context and how it sounds is probably why it sounds the way it does. And it still just sounds fresh. And for me, it's that energy that I already talked about that comes across in that album that often gets missed because, for obvious reasons of wanting to be a part of a thing, whereas they seem to be really carving a sound out of probably they just didn't have much equipment and relied on bass and high frequencies and bleeps, and the Sheffield sound. So
well, because that's the interesting thing. I don't have the background, as you know, that you do in this kind of music, but that stark contrast between just low and high and the sort of resisted urge, or maybe, as you say, it was a technical thing, but just not filling in the middle to any like excessive extent, and just leaving those two elements there is like really striking. And also as well, just I found some of the vocal samples like quite angular. There's one song, I'm trying to remember what it was. Is it called We Are Back? It's got this
the We Are Back track.
Yeah. This like really distorted, like blocky sort of vocal sample. I was quite surprised at how like angular it felt for a record released in like the early 90s.
I mean, We Are Back is a track that really stands out on the album as being like, I think angular is a really good way to describe it. It's not jarring, it's just striking. Yeah. Like in the context of the album, it is already very striking. We Are Back is like a hard right angle to it, and yet landing in the same place. It's just, I've got to tell you this beautiful story. We put this little music festival on. I say music festival as a bunch of us with the PA and in Dorset back when I was growing up, and it was basically me playing music to a few friends and the rest of the town just not enjoying it. And it's being a tourist town, seaside town. There was a group of people that were there on holiday, and one of them had sent their girlfriend up to me playing the music, and they said, "Oh, we want to ask if you've got a record, but my friend's embarrassed, and my boyfriend's embarrassed to ask, and you probably don't have it." And I said, sure, what is it? And I don't DJ really because I hate that whole thing, but especially requests. They said, "Oh, have you got We Are Back by LFO?" And it was like, wow,
no way.
You know. And they were phoning up their friends from wherever they came from, holding it to the speakers, you know, by the seaside at night time, listening to this track. And I think like it's those moments where you recognize a particular track has the power to connect people in this universal language that I mentioned before. And you've really got to have a palette or a need to find that sort of music or appreciate that music, and recognize those moments that you can share it, you know. And I think when it's when there's nothing wrong with the kind of dance scene as a whole, but when you've got an abundance of similar formulaic music that has something to it, fine, but there's something very special for those things that went out on the edge a little bit and tried to redefine things. And I think for me, I'm very much about challenging and redefining everything, to my detriment, no doubt. But I really, really like that, yeah.
And do you have a favourite track on this one?
So I had to think if there would be a favourite track, and I think, I mean, I can say a track that if I had to pick one, I could pick one, but probably Mentok is, I think it's Mentok 1, I think, or Mentok it's called. But the whole album has a flow that really, all the tracks, you kind of, if you have it on CD like I did, and it probably has this on some of the digital versions, you often get the snippets at the end, at the beginnings of the next track, where they're all kind of glued together, almost like this kind of mini kind of mix, if you like, but it's not mixed. So you there's a real sense of flow that goes through this whole album.
Right, yeah.
It wants you want to listen to the next track and be enjoying that one as much as you just listened to the previous one. But I think the Mentok track and track 14 is another one that kind of stand out. They're just sort of Mentok because of the sound qualities, and the bass is very distorted and lots of metallic kind of hats. The patterns are like, there's just a hat on every single step, and it's really crunchy. Track 14 I liked because it's just called track 14, and I love that idea that really fits me. But yeah, musically probably Mentok. That first sort of third of the album has a flow that, yeah, you could easily argue it's one whole track. The other track that I probably want to point out is the single. Now often the singles on the album is the one you want to skip because you just get sick of it.
Totally, yeah.
LFO by LFO is not a track that you ever want to skip, you know. So yeah, they're all really good, but Mentok's pretty cool too.
Martin, let's go to your second important record. So we're going chronologically.
I think we are, yeah. I think we are.
Cool, great. So that would make this, Aphex Twin, Selected Ambient Works, 85-92?
It is, yeah.
Cool.
Which is you probably hear like a collective groan of like, but also everyone agreeing, you know?
Yeah,
but,
totally. I think this is where the crowds are really hoping that Martin is interesting. So, so yeah, tell me about why this album is important to you.
So I heard I don't know how it's pronounced, Aegeopolis, I think it's track 3 or 4, which is this sort of heavy bass line track. And I heard that track on a late night dance program called BPM, that if anyone in the UK kind of stayed up till like 3 a.m, you got a little insight into the kind of emerging kind of underground music scene, club culture scene and electronic music scene through this BPM program that was originally presented by Dave Durrell and Brenda Tahoy, I think her surname's pronounced. If anyone who's seen that, just their dynamic on screen is hilarious. Lots of early interviews with lots of legendary people at their early parts of their career. And in between a lot of the splicing of the club scene and interviews, they would play like, you know, new albums and new releases. And they played a snippet of a track from a video release, like a VHS, if anyone remember those, called Future Shock. So it's compilation video. So you've got like 90s kind of graphics, the early computer graphics, and some kind of like, you know, multiple layered video kind of textures. And this track was on there, and so this is being played through. Sometimes I'd stay up to 3 a.m. Sometimes I'd set the timer on our VCR to record this stuff, and I'd watch it on the next morning. And through VHS, the bass line of this. So this track it's a bass line as the melody. The bass line is kind of like the lead melody, if you like.
Yeah.
And then there's a kind of an 808. Well, it's an R8 drum machine, but it's like an 808 drum sounds underneath it. So there's a lot of bass there, and through VHS tape the whole thing just disappears into crunch. It's not by, you know, design, but it's just the format's not going to support it. And I had never heard a track that used a bass line as a melody. That just seemed to blow my mind.
Yeah.
So I rushed down to the local Woolworths, which was, for people that don't know, was like a shop that used to exist that had like music in it and sweets. And they had Future Shock on the shelf, which blew my mind because I come from a small seaside town that never had anything. And you had Brian Eno on there, Higher Intelligence Agency on there, The Orb, which I'd heard of because they were on everything, always the last track. You had a few other things on there. And you had a pair of like glasses that made you look like, everything looked like you were looking as like a bee, like all hexagons, and you were meant to put these glasses on and watch this thing. And that was how I found Aphex Twin. So went and bought the album alongside the Obsession compilation, which I've mentioned to you before.
Yes. Yeah.
So there was a turning point in realizing Aphex Twin and letting go of like the kind of rave scene, if you like, the Obsession CD I only bought for one track and it was kind of cut short, the Top Buzz track. But the Aphex thing, I listened to it and I didn't like the album apart from that one track.
No way.
It was like, what is this? This is an ambient music, because I was kind of, the idea of ambient music was kind of quite different. Mm-hmm. So that was the first thing. And it was like music that I recognized I kind of wrote, but this was really different and kind of, again, so it took me a few listens. And I remember me and my friend Matthew had gone to I think Southampton, and I bought this album there. And I put it on at his house and I was like, man, I don't know if I like this. And then 2 days later, I came back. I was like, "You have got to listen to this thing. This is blowing my mind." So yeah, that was how I found it.
What changed? How come you started to like it?
I think it's a classic case of when you're exposed to new music, and it's the things that you think you've learnt about what are the qualities you look for in finding the next piece of music. You know, I know my ignorance as a young kid, I know what I'm looking for, kind of thing. Yes, but you're constantly met with these. I mean, maybe less so now. I don't know. I don't personally get this as much now myself, but I'm sure people that are finding music for the first time or finding interesting new music for the first time, there's a certain music that really catches, or certain albums or releases that really capture them, that redefines what they understood as, I guess, acceptable, or understood as the question you'd ask is, can we do that? It was especially from someone making music. Can I do that? Are we allowed to do that kind of thing? So I think that really just tore the rule book up around these things, and yet felt so familiar because a lot of the sound qualities were sort of similar. I remember I compared it. My brother had my brother Paul, who had the LFO album, he was doing up a Metro in the garage, which he never finished, and it had these huge speakers in it. And he was playing Michael Jackson's Bad album, which, without looking at the dates, must have been around the same time, I guess, that come out.
I think so. Yeah.
So he played Michael Jackson's Bad on his Metro's bass bins, and I put in this album as a comparison, and this one sounded really flat and muffled compared to a high-end production.
Yeah.
And yet this album, it's my point is it kind of comes out of the bedroom. It comes out of this inferior equipment and this kind of quality, and the idea that high-end production and the correct ways to master, the correct ways to present sound are not applicable here, because this is not the world that we're working in. We're working with experimenting and trying to redefine stuff. So for me, this really it captures that in a different way that sort of LFO didn't. It's sort of very muffly and bassy and badly produced, and I think Aphex Twin even says it was it's recorded on his tape cassette and it had been passed around to all his mates, and the fact that this is stood up there as one of the best albums ever it kind of shows how things can be done.
Yeah, I also read in an article that I don't think this is true. Recordings sound quality has been described as poor due to it being recorded onto a cassette damaged by a cat. But it doesn't sound like cat damage to me. It just sounds like general tape erosion. But again, I guess that's an early sort of trinket of just Richard D. James, isn't it? Just throwing stuff out there.
Yeah, his whole thing. I think there's even a track on there. It's either that one or Polygon Window that's got a date. Oh no, it is this, of course. The 85 to 92 thing. Yeah. That some of this music, that's another really good point. The fact that some of this music had been written in 85 blew my mind.
Right.
I think it's a bit of BS, honestly. Because 99%, I think there's only one track on there that could have been written in 85, which is the ambient one, because every single other track has an R8 drum machine on it. And if you look at the dates, the R8 drum machine come out I think 89 or not. I think it came out in 89. So, but it's beside the point.
Yeah.
The fact that it's come out in 92 is balmy, It's if you had to predate it a few years, whatever,
Yeah.
So
I also think this is someone who's produced a record which has this hazy obfuscation just blanketing the whole thing, and someone who's then subsequently said that he sleeps 2 hours a night. This sense of collapsing time, it's like a dislodged memory, isn't it? Just I don't know how old I was when I made this album.
The dates get sketchy, don't they?
Yeah. So you heard the one with the big bass line. I think I know which one you're talking about. It's been ages since I listened to this record, but there's one with a very prominent, lovely bass line that I think you're talking about. Is that your favourite, or do you have another track that you would consider? Again, it may be like LFO, where maybe there's not a constant hard favourite, and it is an album that flows together very nicely. So that all said, do you have a favourite track?
Well, no, you're right. Again, it's a bit like the LFO album. But if I had to pick one, and I mean, the Aegeopolis track that I mentioned with the bass line is the way I found it. But I think the track that always seems to grab me I think it's Scotch Key 7th Path, which is, for anyone who knows their track titles, and I'm not one of these people, I literally had to look this up before the call, but it's this sort of, it's the one that captures this slower pace and sinister quality the best. And there's a particular sound in the first sort of few handful of bars that happens once, and it's kind of this slow grindy thing, and then this dong sound happens, and then that dong sound never happens again. And I remember that sound when I was a paper boy at the time, and I used to be half asleep, never knew where I was. And that sound used to always make me jump. I'd think I'd hear it from somewhere else, or someone said something near me or something.
Yeah.
And I kind of felt that the idea that an artist would kind of introduce this really nice kind of quality in a track but only use it once at the time felt, because everything was very kind of formulaic and structured and build-ups or whatever it might be. And this was constantly playing with the ideas of what structure can be and what sounds should be or could be. I think that track kind of captures that eeriness and edginess that I really, really latch onto. So I think there's a lot of, but having said that, the whole album does that, but that one really kind of does it quite well. There's a few on there that do that quite well, but I think, Scotch Key Seventh Path is, it's one of those that you put on and you probably don't know it by title, but you certainly recognize it.
Yeah.
I think it's a really awesome track. Yeah.
You mentioned Polygon Window as well as another one that you ended up picking up. I mean, what has your relationship with Aphex Twin been like since discovering this record? How has it changed?
Since discovering this album, Aphex Twin's been probably the most inspirational artist for me.
Wow.
Up until Come to Daddy come out. I think post Come to Daddy, I kind of slowly checked out, which is the kind of turning point for me that kind of went into that kind of more drum and bassy, kind of drill and bassy kind of territory.
Yeah.
And more complexity seemed to be the name of the game, and the production kind of quality started changing. It got a bit more funky. It was way more palatable. It became way more popular. So anything, I mean, not that you should use popularity as a metric, but I have to question if a lot of people like something, it's probably not very good, because it means that it's more palatable, it's more accessible. And I think, like, for me, that early stuff tends to be, for the people that are into the later stuff, and you're a child of your time, so everyone has their entry point, like I said before.
Yeah.
But for me, that the qualities that were really important to me were kind of evident up until kind of weren't evident post Come to Daddy, but were in abundance in the early releases. I think that's probably my relationship with his music. So Polygon Window was just more of 85 to 92 in some respects.
Right.
And then this sort of stuff that come out afterwards was entering into the latter part and transition, but was still in its own right, were very, very different, like I Care Because You Do and the Richard D. James album. They're all kind of quite crazy and groundbreaking of their time. But then at some point, it just was more of the same sort of stuff. Incredible, but the interests were different. And obviously, yes. I'm growing up as well, and I'm listening to different stuff as well. So, for me, it's not... I'm not necessarily loyal to an artist just because they're still making stuff. I don't think they're the least of my interest, really. It's what they make. Otherwise, I'd still like Richie Hawtin stuff, and I definitely don't.
Oh yeah, that was the other thing I was going to ask, and this ties into a similar theme, which is you mentioned actually when you sent over your list that there's been a re-release with bonus tracks. I couldn't find it anywhere, but tell me about that.
Yeah, so it was a few years back. I think Warp didn't originally release this. It was an R&S Records release. So this was before 85 to 92 was come out before Aphex signed to Warp, or at least there wasn't a release out with Warp that I'm aware of. So I've got a feeling, from if my memory serves me right, Aphex Twin was licensed to R&S. That's why he released Polygon Window as Polygon Window, because he didn't have the rights with Warp at that point.
Right.
So when 85 to 92 was re-released under Warp Records, they added a couple of tracks in there. And I don't know what the tracks are called. They're in the middle, and I think there's one at the end. They kind of sound a bit more like, if anyone who follows Aphex Twin has heard the SoundCloud stuff that come out, there's a period of time that's kind of a bit more funky, but sort of the stuff that wasn't released, I guess. And it sounded like of that era, maybe like I Care Because You Do kind of era, but maybe a bit later. And it was kind of in amongst it. And
Weird.
Yeah, I was kind of like, I don't know. I'd be really curious to find out what the reasons were, but I don't know, other than let's make it appealing. I don't know, like what the reasons were to put those tracks in there. So I'm super fascinated on a curatorial level, but like I don't know what they offered. And maybe there were tracks. I don't believe there were tracks that were knocking around that were omitted originally. They felt very much bolt-ons. So yeah, and it skewed the flow in terms of like the sounds were just different, the production was different. It felt very bonus tracky, but in the middle.
It was kind of
odd.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, one in the middle and I think one near the end. Yeah, it was just like, what's going on here? You know, that sort of stuff's always fascinating when you're really used to. And it's something I am used to, especially when a lot of the stuff you might have had on cassette tape, you might have the end cut off, or you've never heard you're kind of very familiar with this jarring sort of sensation. But this one was a bit of an odd one. Yeah. So if you can get if anyone listens to the original RNS one, or just looks it up and just deletes those tracks if they've got the warp one, then that's
nice.
That's the better listen in my opinion.
Wicked. Martin, all right, we've got one more important record. So what is it?
So this is the Definitive Ambient Works Volume 1 by Pete Namlock,
yes,
which is a compilation, if you like, of a lot of his ambient stuff that was scattered around various early releases that were on Fax Records when this was put out on Rising High Records back in 93.
And this is all his aliases, right, on this compilation, is that right?
Yeah, like I think from what I understand, collaborations that Pete Namlock had was Pete Namlock with someone, not the someone with Pete Namlock. Pete Namlock was the kind of driving force behind a lot of the collaboration stuff, as I understand it. So this is predominantly Pete Namlock under aliases, and if there are other people in there, I think the opening track was a live recording with Dr. Atmos and somebody else, I forget, that they might be turning a oscillator here and there, but I'm pretty sure it's predominantly just Pete Namlock stuff. So it would have been like the ambient tracks that would have been alongside some pretty full-on trancey kind of tracks that I definitely weren't and not really into. But the ambient stuff is incredible. If you need an introduction to Pete Namlock, this is the album that I was my first album to his stuff.
Yeah, and how did that come about? How did you discover this one?
I'm pretty sure. I'm not 100% sure, but I want to put money on that. My friend Matthew, who I went shopping with on that day, maybe a subsequent day or around the same day, he bought this album. So I'm pretty sure he bought it before I did, and I think he probably read about it in I think it might have been in Eternal magazine. There was like a rave magazine, or it might have been Mix Mag or something. One of the magazines that no one liked buying, but you just did. And it was probably in there as this new album. And Mixmaster Morris was kind of like a known artist and DJ at the time, and there was, he had like the Rising High logo sort of bleached into his hair. It was kind of Rising High there was a kind of big thing with a lot of the kind of trance and techno music that was around at that time, and a lot of the early rave stuff that had come out on Rising High. So we knew, that's it. Remembering now, we knew of Rising High Records quite early on because they had the hardcore EP and a lot of the really old hardcore rave music that Casper Pound, who sort of run it, would be kind of creating.
Right.
And then this was sort of Rising High's kind of second chapter, if you like, and it was like you wouldn't expect ambient music on Rising High record. You'd expect like breakbeat, hardcore sort of rave stuff. Again, it was I bought it straight afterwards because it was just incredible. Even he bought the jacket, the Rising High jacket. I bought the Rising High record bag. Which someone who bought some music from us recently actually randomly mentioned it in an email and sent me a photo of his original Rising High record bag as well.
Wow,
so
nice.
So and that was the introduction to it. Yeah.
And you mentioned that these records all had some sort of shift for you, or some sort of shift was instigated in terms of how you thought about music or how you went about your own music. What did that look like for for the definitive ambient collection?
Yeah, I think the cover was a big part, honestly. It was this sort of very black cover with this kind of like molecular kind of atom-like structure built off the logo. The definitive ambient collection, volume 1, was a very enticing title as well. It just sounded like serious, you know, but also kind of quite like ravey, like that. So in the rave era, there was the thing called the chill out room. So like the idea was you go clubbing, and then when you're, I never went clubbing really, but you go clubbing and then you just need to chill out somewhere, and you go out into the chill out room, and there'd be all this kind of music played that's really ambient, and there'd be these whales, like sonic whale sounds and all that kind of stuff. And this kind of seemed to kind of come out of that from a listener's point of view. Obviously, it obviously isn't quite like that's how this album emerged, but it certainly felt like that for our naive ears at the time. And it also felt very, very new, and it felt like what ambient should feel like. It felt very ambient, like this is serious ambient music. So there was very little rhythmical or very little beat at all.
Yeah.
But it was also very musical and very engaging, and just very kind of ominous and sort of ethereal in some places, but and just lots of really incredibly lush qualities. And it was very tied to this idea of outer space and kind of thinking on different planes, and the kind of shamanic stuff kind of come out of all that era, not from Pete Namlick himself, but like that whole kind of space of engaging music in different ways, like psychedelic drugs and all this kind of like narrative. But this was sort of like almost imagination and otherworldly and kind of staring to the stars, and it dealt with kind of more elemental, like element levels, so like water and air and those sorts of qualities. So it just felt very different. So whereas LFO felt, sort of out of the dance scene, but redefining it, Aphex Twin felt like, as it was, just some guy on the arse end of the UK in his bedroom. This felt like integrated, but also elevating a whole experience.
Yeah.
Incredible. And it's just this was a turning point again in that sort of experience of what music could be and how you could connect to it and how you could feel about it, and again just open up the doors. Also, I think the other significant thing about it is it's got a very unique sense of pace and rhythm to it. So he uses these sort of delays that, like sort of a ping pong delay on his sounds, and they're very slow. So you've got this kind of almost dub-like pace to everything.
Totally.
That's very unique. So yeah, absolutely beautiful album. I bought this on LP, like the original on Discogs, for like a ridiculous amount of money.
Oh, right.
Well, I mean, it's like 30 quid, but 30 quid on an album that I, wasn't 30 quid when I wanted it. It seems a lot, but all the stuff that he put out, Dreamfish and Air and all those ones. But this was the intro that had lots of those different stuff on it. Yeah.
So this one, as you said, had an enticing title, the Definitive Ambient Collection. We've talked about Aphex Twin, the selected ambient works. Was the word ambient a real draw to you at that time? Was there something happening specifically within this notion of ambient that you were attracted to?
I think so. I think ambient would have been the genre or the style, if you like, that was replacing or challenging kind of the normal music that was around at the time. So normal for me would have been the kind of rave scene. So if you want to look at the glossiest, sugariest end of that would have been the Prodigy and all the stuff that come out when they did their thing.
Yeah.
Like, Charlie and Trip to Trumpton and all that tripe. Then there was lots of kind of other stuff that come around. Then there was the kind of underground kind of DJ kind of culture stuff that a lot of that music you didn't really know, or I didn't where we were, because we were in the arse end of the seaside town, know really who were the people behind it. And this was kind of like a step away from that. It was kind of, like I said before, like this is almost like the bedroom artist. This is sort of the listener's experience. And at this point, artificial intelligence hadn't really happened. So the idea that this intelligence label that was kind of put on things a bit later hadn't really happened. So this was kind of more a sort of a step away from even the popular stuff of the underground music, if you like. So I think that ambient label you could probably swap out for, electronic music in a few years' time, like in 95, 94, quite quickly. But having said that, the ambient quality was very different to electronic music. That kind of, it's a very different pace. It lowers your heart rate. You've got very different sound qualities. Even like shoegaze stuff now is like it's not the same deal. This is kind of oscillator sweeps and, like I said, whale sounds and water, but not in a kind of field recording quality, in a kind of put you in a different space sense.
In fact, I've had Pete Namlook feature on the podcast before. Like we did.
Really?
Kush Aurora picked Alien Community. Have you heard those ones?
I haven't. I think that's a bit later, but no, I haven't. No.
Yeah, because do you know what? It was interesting because these sounds were immediately like triggered a memory for me of something I heard in relation to this podcast. And Alien Community is Jonah Sharp and Pete Namlook. I think it's like 2 hours, and the sort of ping pong delay and the pacing you talk about on this one is very present as well on that collaboration with Jonah Sharp. So yeah, really interesting stuff. But obviously Pete also, you ran Fax Records, right? Was that on your radar at all at that time as well?
I think only because it was in the liner notes, like
right.
Wouldn't have been otherwise. No, and I've never bought anything from Fax. I think this was, still haven't, never, because it's just sort of this sort of, I'm not sure why. I guess I did more recently revisit or visit the stuff I hadn't heard before, in the hope that I'd find sort of similar stuff to what we'd found.
Right.
So like the albums for me were, Definitive Ambient Works Volume 1 and Volume 2, and Dreamfish and Air and Silence were the ones that we kind of had in circulation. And I kind of went on the hunt for more of the stuff that I'd missed, and I haven't found anything that I'd have and enjoy now that I hadn't already had. So It felt like the selection that Casper Pan and that lot had took from Fax and presented was perfect to my taste. And the other stuff kind of didn't quite grab me. I mean, full respect to Pete Namlook, but it was kind of like, I can see how this curatorial kind of role and this repackaging and presenting really played a bigger part than I probably appreciated at the time. But yeah, I mean, Fax was never really on my radar. I think there was almost the labels that were so obscure, like to get the really obscure labels back in the early 90s in Swanage, Dorset, was like you kind of had to know your stuff, and I didn't leave my bedroom, Jack. So
yeah, fair. The other thing I wanted to ask about as well, and you mentioned actually that these different aliases are potentially references to different collaborations with different people, albeit with Pete Namlook at the helm. But what I found very interesting is, so I listened to this on the Bandcamp, and each track is listed as being by a different alias. His energy is so potent throughout this entire thing, and it's very consistent quality that's throughout all these tracks. They don't deviate that much from each other to the extent where you're like, oh blimey, we're somewhere else now. I know as well that you kind of work with different aliases within your music, and I think with solo projects I always find it so fascinating to consider like different aliases from a specific solo artist. What's the point when you're working under a specific alias that you're like, right, I need to break out of this box now and start working under a new one? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like it's interesting you kind of draw the parallel or the comparison with Namlook and aliases, because I've had this thought before that the purpose of aliases for me, how much previous, my exposure to early music and just kind of what I understand of that space is for me now. Does Pete Namlook's multiple aliases have any influence on me, or Aphex Twin's different aliases have any influence on me, for example? I know when I visit a Discogs for, finding someone's catalogue and I see an abundance of different aliases, like Richie Horton's a good example. He's got so many aliases, I don't know what they are. That does kind of give me a sense of the era. Like there seems to be often like a purely functional reason. Like it's that there's stylistically, there hasn't been the artistic or general listeners' understanding of a particular sound or style had emerged yet that warrants it being under the same name.
Yep, totally. Yeah.
There's probably like maybe there's something about the early labels trying to do contracts and trying to work like traditional labels and like, oh, I've licensed my name to here and you can't use it. There's undoubtedly some of that.
Yes.
There's the compilations as well, like having a track licensed to a compilation. There's the kind of legal kind of stuff that happens. So a good comparison would be when drum and bass, like in jungle, and then intelligent drum and bass, and then jump up, and then, you know, or like techno, and then tech house, and then garage, and all these kind of genres started emerging. There was a narrative that emerged in the sort of mid to late 90s that there's an abundance of saturation. There's a saturation happening, and there was a lot of artists and DJs talking about this idea of saturation, and that all these different subgenres are, and that it kind of, it's in essence kind of went, and this isn't a criticism of this, but in essence it would be like, I'm using 808 hats, so I'm making a different genre to you, basically doing the same pattern but on a 99. So it was kind of almost that basic, and I think it was probably just artistic expression, wanting to separate yourself, and not forgetting that using an 808 drum machine was kind of like, oh, using an 808 drum machine, you're using presets. Like there's radio interview with Aphex Twin going on about not using an 808 like that's some massive thing, and It's kind of weird to hear it now, but it kind of was back then. Like, you were using the same drum sounds as everybody else, so there needs to be something more. So there was that look for something more, and I think aliases probably were a way of kind of compartmentalizing and a sense of progress emerging. So that's definitely in my DNA. I think how I probably use aliases now, well, to start off with, I don't use aliases anymore.
I was going to say, yeah.
But yeah, we've just literally done away with the whole thing. Like, no name, no credit, like, done with this, for a reason that's probably warrants a whole other program. But yeah, when there was aliases, there was a kind of feeling where it was a very different sort of sound. It was kind of like the POC kind of sound was sort of, and I wouldn't say these were sounds that I personally felt that were mine. They were entities in their own right that could have been used for anyone. It was always kind of like, it was like a project.
Right.
So if you wanted to take that project, you could, in theory, use that name. It was not that ever happened, but the POC was kind of like this cleaner, dubby, gnawed synthesizer sound, right? And then there was a POC EP that came out on An Epic Records, a really small label run out of Japan, which I highly recommend checking out. They very rarely release anything. I'm not sure if they're entirely running still, but they still have their Bandcamp. So there's a Pathways EP on that, and that was under the POC name, for example. But it was like, that was, for me, felt odd because it was very obviously dubby, and it was, it was using Nord, but it was a different Nord. And it's like, oh, can I use the same name? It's just bizarre. So that's probably in there. The typeface thing was like more repetitive. It was a different project, like this repetitive thing. And I tried to find a way to connect it to typography, and basically felt like that didn't conceptually work at all. It felt forced, and probably was. So yeah, you definitely kind of have, but I felt those aliases ended up compartmentalizing the whole approach too much, and that I couldn't allow myself to think in different ways. And I ended up thinking either in this box or out of this box. So I can only assume these artists that have had an abundance of those aliases initially probably had a similar creative struggle, perhaps, like a headspace that needed to be compartmentalized to kind of allow themselves the creative flexibility. And maybe Pete Now's got so many aliases on that one thing.
Yeah.
And as you say, they all kind of sound like the same thing. Like, he's got an alias. Has he got an alias called Four Voice or something?
Oh, yeah, something. Yeah. I think I saw that. Yeah.
Which is just him, I think, playing around with I think it's an Oberheim 4-voice synthesizer. I'm guessing. I don't know. It seems pretty like, I use this synth, so I'm going to change.
I've got a new name. Wow. Yeah.
I don't know.
My last question for you, Martin, is about how music comes into your life now as a listener. Like, what are the main ways in which you kind of consume, buy, and listen to music?
So I rarely buy new music very, very often at all now. That's completely false. I do buy music, but I typically buy it because it's a friend making music. I want to support it. It's for different transaction. It's like I sort of buy for the algorithm to some degree.
Right, yeah.
Or I buy the support to some degree. That's not the rule for sure, but there's a need to buy it because I feel there's been many times where I've not bought something out of fear because, like, I might have mentioned this before, Jack, but like it might be such a good and important album. I do not want it even in my home because it will just mess with my mind because it's too good. So there's definitely a case where I don't buy stuff like Autechre. I don't buy their music anymore. It's just, what's the point? You know, it's like I don't want them in my head anymore. You know, like why not? You took over my brain in the 2000s. I think like certain artists, Autechre is a good example that you kind of just end up trying to make Autechre music,
right?
And it's just like it's just destructive, at least for me.
Yeah.
So I find there's a definite point where I deliberately don't buy stuff, and there's probably more periods in the time that I've listened to music that I've not bought specifically, and when I have bought, it's felt like the only analogy, and it's pretty accurate. You're at a friend's wedding, and there's a side table full of really kind of naff sausage roll kind of type food, right? And you're not hungry, but you just keep eating this stuff, and because that's where you are, right? That's what you do. And there's a period where I've done that. I've just bought the new Ninja Tunes record, and I've bought the new whatever, and that music just doesn't stand up very quickly. Like, time doesn't even pass that much and it's already kind of gone. So I find I'm a bit more selective in that regards. I try to engage in music. Like, it's less about the purchasing. The stuff I do buy is stuff that maybe is broken or worn out. So like I said before, I bought the Pete Alex stuff on vinyl because I really have been enjoying playing vinyl again recently. It's just a whole listening experience that I've kind of somewhat forgotten about. So I've been doing that, and some stuff like some of the early Warp stuff, I think it's BMG Publishing, they used some like cheap glue, so all the Warp stuff is basically falling apart. So like I might, buy some of that occasionally, but typically I don't buy reissues that often because I feel like the purchasing it now versus purchasing it then is a very different purchase. Yeah. So, but buying early Autechre stuff just doesn't tempt me because I'm like, I've kind of, the early stuff for me is amazing, but it's like it's why I don't want to buy it again. Like I want to, I don't know. It's a bit of a weird one that.
Yeah, totally.
I think most music I consume at the moment is through the mastering work and the label and demos. Not that we really like the idea of demos, but often you're sent sort of demos. And like collaborations and experimentations and just kind of more community-based stuff, which I find quite cool. Like I was playing around with some of my friend's stuff today, so I've been listening to his beats and ambient sounds and listen to Lucia's stuff, my partner's stuff occasionally when she's making that. I think that stuff is what ticks me by, and mostly probably my own stuff, to be honest. Like, yeah, I like to just submerge myself in my own sonic world because if it kind of got to an age where I can probably knock out something that fills that void that couldn't be filled when I was a kid, so I just make it.
Wicked. All right, Martin, well, thank you very much. It's been awesome. Really appreciate you coming on to talk about your work and these 3 records. It's been ace. It's been really nice chatting to you, as always, Jack. It's been really cool revisiting these albums and rummaging through my memory and seeing what makes me tick. Thanks. Awesome. And to everyone listening, we'll see you next time. Goodbye. Goodbye.